All right, so now we are live with our friends from System.Data, Arthur and Shai, and today we look at 4 issues with new APIs. Shai, do you have any desires in order, or should we just take them as they come here?
There's only 2 which kind of belong together, but we can just take them in order.
All right, then take it away.
This order should be. Okay, so this one is pretty straightforward, I think. System.Data has, ADO.NET has an API for getting schemas. There's 2 APIs. One, you have a connection, you want to get the schema of the entire database. And the second one is you have a reader for a query that you executed, and you want to get the resultset schema for that result set. These APIs, I think, are among the last and the provider abstraction layer, which are still sync only, and this is about introducing the async counterparts. So it's pretty straightforward. If we look, the first one is get schema async on DB connection. On the sync side, there's actually 3 methods which are overloads. Here I just collapse them into one with optional parameters. That's about it. On the DB data reader side, it's a little bit more complicated for reasons which I don't have the complete context on. So backing up, there's actually 2 reader schema APIs in ADO.NET. One is the traditional one, returning a data table. And back in .NET Core 1, when we thought we were removing data table, another one was introduced which returns a read-only collection of DB columns. So there's two APIs. This introduces async counterparts for both of these APIs. So the first one is pretty straightforward, get schema table async on DB data reader. The second one was introduced, I'm not sure why, via an extension method and an interface. So IDB column schema generator is an interface that a reader can implement to signify they support this. Otherwise, the extension just checks whether the reader implements it, and if not, does a shim kind of implementation. So for now, I'm proposing to add the async counterparts in exactly the same way for consistency, rather than on DB data reader itself. I think that's about it. One more thing I'm going to say. So for now, I'm proposing adding these methods as returning tasks rather than value tasks. These are schema APIs. They're not considered perf sensitive at all. They will almost always complete asynchronously, except for some very minor usages. So really, I don't really see any sort of reason to go value task here unless,
And on top of that, I mean, last time I looked, data table itself isn't particularly allocation friendly.
Nothing here. Like, nothing here is.
One more on top of that is not a big deal.
Absolutely. So even the alternative API, which is a bit better, so which doesn't go through data table, in the end, it's still basically the API is supposed to allocate a bunch of structures describing your result set metadata, which are objects. So by nature, it allocates in any case, and that additional allocation is not going to weigh in.
Yeah, this all seems fine to me. The only question I would have is so you mentioned the new ones, the sync versions were added because the data table one didn't exist. Then we added back the data table one. Do people use the one that we added that was meant to replace data table and then didn't? Or like, is it sort of, is it by the wayside, or do people actually prefer that one?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't have any usage statistics on them. So again, there's a backwards compaction, so it works. Providers don't have to implement it. It's going to work anyway. It's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure if it would impact this decision in any way, but yeah, it's a good question.
I mean, the only reason I'm asking is if literally no one uses it because people only care about the data table one, then adding a new API for the async version may not be useful. But if people use it, then fine.
So, I mean, I think we introduced it relatively early. I want to say like something like 4.7.1 or something. So it's already a few years out. Unless the implementation cost is high, I don't think it's a big deal. I would just have it for consistency, because otherwise you have to explain to people why one is async and the other one is not. That seems worse to me.
One last note.
So one question I have is for the extension ones, like, so how they're implemented. Like, what does get column schema async do?
So it checks if the reader, so it's an extension method. If the reader implements IDB column schema generator, which is the interface you see, then it calls into that method. Otherwise, it's going to call into the traditional one, so the one that returns a data table, and it's going to construct these DB columns out of the data table.
I
So
see.
basically, it's a shim.
So basically, the async version would call the async version of the data table version, and then basically this way it would be async, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so all of ADO.NET has the async default implementations calling into the sync ones. That's like a uniform thing. And I think here we do the same.
Right. Yeah, I was just curious because when you have extension methods, I was just concerned that we don't have the way to actually call anything async there. But if you just call the other ones, then yeah, that would just fall out. I mean, that makes sense. The only concern I have is the interface. I don't know how we do this there because we try to avoid doing that to interfaces because we don't trust really that DIMs will work in all the places we care. And so far we haven't added any DIMs yet.
Do you want to say, so there is an option here of introducing the new async one directly on DB Data Reader. Again, I just am not sure why this was not done originally for the sync one, which is the only reason I'm proposing to do this way. But if we really want to avoid DIMs, then we can just do this instead. It would be weirdly inconsistent, but
I suspect that the reason for the interface is due to unification down to the .NET types and wanting to maintain compatibility with that, but still allow people to do something different. This was probably from back in the portable class library days. That's when we did all these.
Who implements this?
If anyone is actually using the get column schema, which returns the collection of DB column. I can't imagine why, now that data table exists, you would do that. But then, you know, we'd have to do verification of code out there to make sure that that's the case.
So who implements? Sorry, so who implements this guy? Like, is this literally only the reader who implements this guy, or is there anybody else implementing that?
I mean, it's an interface to be implemented by readers, yes. As far as I know, there's absolutely no reason anybody else would ever implement this. I personally kind of support, I like and want to push forward this newer API simply because it's better in the sense that it dumps data table, which is weakly typed. It gives you a strongly typed kind of API access to the results metadata, which is why I think it's, you know, it's a good thing in general.
Yeah, I suspect the only reason we added this interface was in order to avoid the... No, actually, I don't know why we added the interface. Like because you still take the type directly. So I don't understand why DB Data Reader, we wouldn't just have added a virtual method on that guy. This seemed to be a cleaner model than going through the interface.
Yeah, I don't know either.
I mean, if we really need an interface, I'd rather add a new one that derives from DB column schema generator that adds the new async version than adding a DIM for that. But if we can help it, I would rather avoid the interface altogether.
So are you saying you'd prefer just adding a virtual async method on reader?
Yeah, in the same way that you already do it here, right? You would just add another one parallel to get schema table async. You would have get column schema async, and then you would just call that guy from get column schema async from the extension method. I mean, the extension method in and of itself doesn't seem to be super useful to begin with, right? Like, it seems like we just did that because reasons, right? I think this might have been the as Arthur mentioned, the portable class library limitations that we couldn't actually add the members on the right types.
Yeah, I think that was the root of all of this messing around. I just don't remember the specific details of who and why needed to implement that interface.
I mean, we have the exact same issue with WebSockets where we have a bunch of async methods that are extension methods. And so the way we have done it on our side is we basically kept the extension methods, and then we have effectively actual public methods on the underlying WebSocket one, but we don't expose it in reference assemblies. So as far as the user is concerned, there's only one home for the method. But for implementation reasons, doing everything in the extension methods is shitty, right? Because you can't actually access any state. So basically, I think it made... So one thing we could be doing is we could just say, that, well, we can't because in this case it's a virtual, right? So yeah, it seems cleaner to not expose the extension method and literally just have the method as an instance method on DB data reader as virtual.
So I found one issue that was filed in 2016. Let me see if I can chat here. Which is asking about implementation of that. And the response is you don't need to do it unless... Hang on, I lost the webpage. Unless you want to expose the schema from SQLite data reader itself. But I don't really still follow the logic there.
It probably would be good if somebody could offline like investigate why we did these interface stands to make sure that it's literally just for what we think it is for, so that we don't break something else.
With Bryce. I'll follow up with Bryce because he seems to be involved in this discussion a lot. So hopefully he remembers what Diego was doing.
Yeah. Otherwise, I think the proposal makes sense. What are the arguments for get schema async, like collection name and restrictions?
Yeah, so collection name is what do you want to get out? Is it the list of tables, the list of columns, the list of whatever? There's like a set of fixed things, stringly typed, which you can ask for. And then restrictions is your way of saying, I want to basically filter out only specific tables. So I want any table, like I want all the information for these tables rather than all the tables in the database. That's the way the API looks.
I see. And should we take a raw string array or should we take something less?
You mean like an enum or something?
No, I'm thinking like an enumerable of string rather than a string array. Like, doesn't have to be a string array. Because usually we don't take arrays directly. Unless it's buffers.
This is a copy of the sync API.
Oh, I see. Yeah, in that case, keep it the same. Like, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's old APIs for sure.
So we do have a guideline that says if you have more than 2 defaulted parameters, you should have an overload with no defaults that just forwards to the defaulted parameters one, just because we've found from usability studies that some people get confused by default parameters in IntelliSense. So that would be a non-virtual method that just calls your one virtual. It's just there as a ease of use call.
So would you say have 3 methods here? Like because there's 2 optional parameters?
No, so you would just have so get schema async that just takes a cancellation token defaulted to default, and then the get schema async that takes the collection name and restrictions and cancellation token. The latter being the one that needs to be virtual, and the simple one just being there to be a forward. Though, having said that, I don't know that we've actually looked at that in the context of you have a bunch of defaults on an async thing. So if that feels unnatural, then don't. Because generally when we've done it, it's been essentially chopping the whole signature, but since async says end with the cancellation token, that mixes interestingly. So I guess the question is, do you expect many people to want to call Git, or do many people call Git schema and not specify the options? If so, then accelerating the I just want to pass you a cancellation token and not specify a collection name and restrictions sounds virtuous.
Okay, so I have to look at it, but so if you don't specify a collection name, my expectation is collection name is usually going to be passed, because you're going to have to specify whether you want tables or columns or what, because the default is, if I'm not mistaken, to get the list of possible collections. So if you call it without an argument, you're going to get the like a data table that contains the possible values you can pass into collection name. Now it's coming back to me, which is not necessarily very useful. It's like a reflection kind of thing. However, the restrictions one, I do suspect is going to be null most of the time, because you're going to want to get all the tables, but I mean, you're not necessarily going to want to filter all the time. So if anything, I would say maybe there should be like an overload that does get the collection name and the cancellation token, but not the restrictions, if we're looking at it that way. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so overloading for matching what usage patterns you expect people to do is totally legit. Just make sure that only the longest one is actually declared virtual.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, if you just mirror the one that we have for the sync version, because the sync version basically has 3 overloads, right? The one that takes no arguments, just the collection name and restriction. So I would suggest, in order to just keep that symmetric, I would just add 2 non-virtual methods, one that takes no arguments and one that just takes the collection name, and then keep on the virtual one only the cancellation token optional.
Are they virtual also on the sync? I'm just to be...
Well, I would think...
I mean, the guidelines would then further say you shouldn't actually have this last one be public virtual. It should be public non-virtual and call it protected virtual. But if you already have public virtuals, it's probably weirder to mix paradigms.
So on the sync version, everything is virtual, but that I think is a bug. I think they should just literally just cleanly forward. It seems very weird to me that you would only override one of them. I mean, that's the general violation of the template method pattern, right? Where we basically say we have a worker method somewhere that does everything, and then you just have convenience overloads that just forward to that. Like, they should not be virtual.
So maybe the one thing is that if you, I'm looking at the docs now. So if you are invoking one of the overloads that accepts the strings, but you pass on all, then you're supposed to get an argument exception. So you're supposed to get an argument null exception, basically. So the way the sync works is, if you basically don't want to specify collection name, you have to call the overload without anything.
Okay, that's even dumber. I mean, like I've seen that as well in the BCL, and we are like, since we added nullable notations, we found all the places where we are hideously inconsistent with these kind of things. But that's generally bad as well, in my opinion. They should really be convenience overloads, right? That just forward. It seems very weird to me that we would say, well, if you don't want to have a restriction, then you can't pass in null. Well, if there's an overload that doesn't take restrictions, it seems like it should be the same as passing in null for that.
I think my experience of the system data APIs is that they didn't follow framework guidelines for .NET Framework 1, and ever since then they've been the same and no breaking changes or anything. So they basically don't follow any kind of reasonable guidelines or any kind of reasonable design for most things. We can try and fix this, when we're adding new async methods, and I'm not against making them better, but it is what it is in terms of the terrible design on system data.
Sure. I guess the question is now, how do we make it consistent with what the sync one looks like, right? I mean, the sync one basically has 3 overloads. We can either decide that we also have 3 overloads that are all virtual and they have the same behavior as the sync one, meaning they will throw if you don't pass in, like if you pass in null for any of the arguments. I'm not opposed to that, but it's like, I agree with Jeremy. I think having one method that just where everything is optional, we know that doesn't work very well with people.
I mean, we could just have 3 virtual ones with exactly the same rules and be 100% consistent and just have each one of them forward to the sync counterpart. That's possible.
Is DB connection something that actually gets overridden in practice?
That is.
Do people extend it?
That's the main class that database providers in .NET extend. Yeah.
You can't actually create a naked DB connection. It's not abstract, but there's no way to construct one.
But it's done by like the MySQL driver would be used. So this is the thing that people do when making custom database drivers, effectively.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Because on the one hand, the principle of least surprise is make your async look exactly like your sync does, but given that we're adding virtual methods late in the game, now there's the extra complexity question of somebody updates to go add the async support. Like, do they really need to override all three virtuals, or should they be able to get away with only overriding the longest one? And so the reason that that's part of why the template method pattern suggests effectively never having a public virtual, because if you wanted the behavior of calling with a null collection name in the public method to throw, that would be fine. But when it calls the protected one, the protected one has the, like, you will get null if they called the simpler overload, and that means do your default thing, or you'll turn that into the string that is the correct thing, and you'll document you'll never get null here. Don't bother revalidating it. Or
I'm not pushing back on what you're saying, but that is we frequently get people saying, okay, I'm trying to use mock, I'm trying to create test doubles, and now the template methods are protected virtual, and that's a major pain for me. So yeah, I mean, it's okay. I don't disagree with it, and usually using mock to create those things is probably the wrong thing to do anyway, but it does, when we make template methods protected virtual, we always get people complaining that that's a big pain for them, especially in things like DB connection, where I would say that 99% of the implementations of DB connection are fakes for testing.
Fair enough. I mean, I don't quite see why a mock would have a problem with that, since if it's using override,
you can't access the protected method from the API surface, so you have to use the complex method of override, telling your mock to override a protected method, because you can't just use a Lambda expression to refer to it, for example.
Oh, this is that particular libraries can't do it for you for free.
Well, it's not just. I mean, yes, mock is the most common library which doesn't, but it's not a restriction that mock is arbitrarily producing. It's that you've made it so you can't reference this publicly by design, right? And therefore nobody can strongly reference it publicly by design, and therefore you have to go to not referencing it and using string names or whatever to do it, regardless of whether it's mock or not. It's just a consequence of moving things off the public surface.
Fair enough. I mean, anytime I've ever mocked something, I just extend it and then do the overrides, and then it just doesn't talk to the back end, and like that's exactly what
mock
protected's
but
for.
mock is like the 6th most downloaded NuGet package. So
Sure.
It's not like everybody's doing that. I mean, we got rid of mock in EF for the same reasons a long time ago, and we do that as well. But I'm just saying that it's feedback I have seen a lot over the years.
Yeah.
Just add one argument against adding 3 virtual methods here is that the 3 sync, the implementation for the 3 sync ones is the throw. So providers have to implement them. But if we are now to add the async ones, they would delegate to the sync ones. So if a provider doesn't override those 3, then they would never know. So nobody would ever know. It would just, work sync instead of async, which is not a good thing. So,
hold on, let me understand this. So what happens right now if I build a provider that inherits from DB connection and I only override, let's say, the middle one?
So the other 2 are going to throw not supported. I've got the source here, like in front of me.
I see. So the base, sorry, I meant the sync version. So the sync versions, the base ones all throw.
The sync, exactly.
So
there is no delegation between them.
I see. So that means if we do the same thing here, where basically the async versions are called the sync ones, then you would get a platform not supported exception when the provider didn't implement the sync versions either. So the only problem you have is when the provider overrides the sync behavior but not the async behavior. But that's always the case, no matter whether we have 3 virtuals or not. Correct?
It's true, but yeah, I mean, that's true. But assuming a reasonable provider overrides like the one with all the arguments, but maybe doesn't the other two because they reasonably expect them to just delegate, as we've been discussing, then you end up with two methods which are sync and one which isn't. But I mean, it's not super
Right.
strong.
I mean,
Well,
I think it's worth pointing out that the behavior here for almost all providers when we implement this initially is they're going to call get schema async and they're going to get a sync version running. That's what ADO.NET does. So given that things like Oracle's provider don't support async at all, it appears like they're getting async, but they're actually getting sync. So the only way that the ADO provider writers are going to realize that anything needs to be done is either they're paying very close attention to our changes that we make, or somebody actually debugs it into their provider, finds out that it's running sync, files an issue to them, and they go and say, okay, now I need to do this work. So basically, in terms of the sync async experience, it's a very bad experience anyway, but we can't change that. That's just the way ADO.NET was designed. I don't feel like we should make all of these virtual on the async for any reasons related to that or anything related to, basically, for some provider writer to override this, they have to understand that it's there and why they're overriding it anyway. And a single virtual method to override makes sense for that.
Well, the one caution that I would give for that is if what the docs suggest the right answer is for the long version of get schema is that it should throw an ANE if collection name is null. If a provider has actually implemented that, that means that you can't have the simple async call the long sync because it would do so with null, which means you do have to do a virtual async deferring to your virtual sync on every single one of these point. Because you don't have a symmetric delegating behavior on the other side.
Well, the other thing I just noticed is that, assuming we would chain, then if you want cancellation, you have to construct the longest one. But if you don't have restrictions, then how would I do that? Because I can't pass in null, right? So that means you would have to add an optional cancellation token for all three methods as well, which seems rather weird. So like maybe we should literally just make them non-virtual and just chain them and say, yep, we're different here because of sanity reasons.
Well, I mean, the problem is if the sync implementation that the virtual is going to, by default, defer to doesn't allow a null collection name, then the thing that did the simple one calling in the into the more complex one now blows up. When if the simple one called the simple one, it would work.
Yeah, although you could just check right now, right?
We could take a totally different approach here and say, actually, we're not actually going to implement the async one to call into the sync one. We're just going to implement it to throw if it's not implemented, at which point you don't get people thinking that this is doing async when it's actually doing sync. And provider writers will need to override something. And in that case, since we're not calling into the sync methods ever, it can just be a single virtual method that they override there.
Or you could just do the minimum thing, right? You could say that the normal so the get schema async implementation on DB connection just checks for nulls and delegates to the shortest version. So for example, if collection name is null, you just call the one with no arguments. If collection name is not null,
I'm somewhat pushing back on the idea that we continue to do what ADO.NET has always done and add async methods that call into the sync versions. Like in this case, I don't see that actually being valuable. Like
I see
people thinking that they're doing async when they're not doing async. It happens all the time with ADO.NET, and I'm not sure we need to. I know to be consistent, we should do the same thing because that's what ADO does throughout. But is it really actually valuable in this case to do that?
So the only downside with that. Sorry, go ahead.
Is there any reason it's less valuable here than any other place in ADO.NET? And I mean, realistically,
change what we've done before. That's the reason this is different.
I mean, I mean, just realistically, this is if we leave this to throw, this is basically not going to work for a lot of some providers at least until they do. Like, we'll never implement this or whatever.
But then if you're doing that, then you have to go change your code to call get schema sync, and you file an issue on your provider, as opposed to not even realizing that it's doing that.
I personally
don't know. It feels. Yeah, that feels dangerous. I mean, in general, anytime we've added these
regardless of whether it's ADO.NET or not, we've delegated to something else. Like when we add, a new overload of stream.write async, it'd be a really bad situation if we made that throw by default rather than delegating to the existing one, because someone, updates their code, they use the new one, they're getting concrete instances that all have it, and then all of a sudden they get one that doesn't and they blow up. And now they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They potentially blew up at a point, in production they haven't really tested well or something, but more so now they're stuck choosing between using the new thing that works everywhere or falling back to the old thing and not being able to move to the new thing until everything they might possibly use appropriately overrides it. And in those situations, people add capability APIs, but that seems overly complex here.
I mean, I get that argument, but I'll point out again that in ADO.NET, masses of people are thinking that they're using .NET with async access to the database, and they're not, because they don't realize that, for example, the Oracle provider just delegates directly everything to the sink. So it's like, it looks like it supports async, and they think, oh, my .NET app is going to have all these advantages of async, and only if they actually debug down and figure out what's going under the hood do they realize that they're not doing any async database.
Sure,
access.
but in general though, like if they wanted sort of the scalability of async and their database provider didn't support that, what are their alternatives?
Well, at least they know not to use that database provider and expect that behavior. Their alternatives are a different database behavior or not use async, right?
Yeah, but that's a huge hammer that you have to change the database that your application is using as its backend.
Yes, but I agree, but you're saying if you need async and you're not getting it, then you can't use the Oracle provider. Period. That is, I mean, is it better to?
Yeah, but it's not a a yay or nay decision, right? It's I want improved scalability. It's a scale, right? I want it to do better, so I'm going to take advantage of async wherever I possibly can. All of a sudden, one API that I want to call throws an exception because the database that I'm using throughout my company doesn't support that brand new method that we just introduced.
It's not, the abstractions don't work that way anyway, so I think that's highly unlikely, but I'm not going to argue this further. Yeah. If we want to continue with asyncs by default, have sync behavior, that's fine.
What do you mean the abstractions don't work that way?
You can't write an application that just works with any ADO.NET provider and expect it to work. It doesn't work like that. It's unrealistic, and people who try and do that generally fail.
Then why do we care about these abstractions at all?
I don't personally very much.
Then why are we adding these?
It's being a bit. So it is the point of these abstractions.
Because you build other things on top of these abstractions, like EF or Dapper or something that actually understands what providers it's working with and how to use those things, and they call different methods on the ADO.NET depending on what they need to do.
So EF, can EF use an arbitrary provider?
Yeah, no. Well, it depends what you mean. You cannot expect to have an application that uses SQL Server change your provider to Oracle, for example, in EF, and expect your application to work. It
what I mean is
almost certainly won't.
What I mean is, will EF call this new method?
No, EF will never do that. This is never used by EF at all.
But it could. But it could be used by something like EF.
It could be used by something else, but EF is never going to use it.
But if it throws, what that's saying is EF effectively, or the equivalent, can't use it because that prohibits it from then being.
No, because it says EF is all EF. Everything in EF can be done sync or async. So if EF calls the async method and it throws, that means you need to use the sync methods in EF because you're not getting async behavior.
Basically,
so
Arthur is saying to move
I need to do everything sync because this one method wasn't supported because we just introduced it.
Why would you have to do everything sync? If you go in a method that calls get schema, then if EF did expose it and it exposed an async version, then you call that async version if you were using async, and if the async version isn't done, then for that method you call the sync version. It doesn't change because the rest
generally,
of your application.
And maybe it's not the case with EF in particular, but generally you don't have a one-to-one correspondence between a public entry point and a single async API called in the entire chain. Generally, you end up doing either multiple things asynchronously or multiple things synchronously, and that's dictated by the entry point.
Yeah, so all EF has sync and async entry points for everything because of this.
I understand. So when you call the async entry point, you call one API,
And under the covers, it's calling A async and B async and C async and D async, right?
No. No, not at all. Not for something like this. It's
Arthur,
not used like that.
That's not how EF works, but that's how something else could work, right?
I agree.
Oh,
So I said I don't want to. To me, the whole thing that people get sync when they think they're getting async, and and we frequently see that as people complaining because this has been something that bit them in the ass because they weren't ready for it. Is that's an issue that I've seen many times over the years. I get the reason for doing it the other way, and I'm not pushing back. If you want to keep doing sync when you do async, that's fine. You keep doing that. I was just bringing up the issue that real customers really report issues with this being very confusing to them and them not understanding what's happening.
Have we thought about, I mean, like people do logging, right, to see the SQL statements, right? Have we ever considered like basically logging and say you just call an async method, but because I don't have a course, because I wasn't overridden, I will be executing synchronously? So the people
It
at
would be
least
great
see
if
that?
the ADO.NET providers did that, but you'd have to file an issue on Oracle to do that, right?
So there's no common logging infrastructure or anything for ADO.NET. There's no way for
The DB
a
connection to
general
actually do
way
that,
for-
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one
It's
of those
certainly
things
not-
where we don't have many options. I mean, I kind of agree with Steven. So my concern is more from a library author where you don't get to control the entire ecosystem. I mean, an app author generally has more control. And I mean, I understand the practical problems when you do something that is less ideal, but that's still better, in my opinion, than having class library authors being scared of methods because somebody might throw. Because what we see in the ecosystem then is that people basically go out of their way to not call these methods. So basically, you hurt your adoption massively if you expose new APIs as throwing. And so you're almost always better just saying, yeah, we accept that there's something less ideal because at least the new thing gets adoption. And then if the adoption is high enough, hopefully there's pressure then on Oracle and others to actually do the right thing. But I guess the problem there is that customers aren't aware, right? So I guess
When did async get introduced? .NET 4.5 in 2010, was that?
Yeah.
So if they've had 10 years, it seems like the pressure's not going to get to them anymore.
Right, but I guess now the question as a library author is if you assume that reality, would you call get schema async then if it might blow up at runtime, or would you not? Because I mean, I think it's probably
Are
still
you
better.
asking me?
Yeah, like if you were like from an EF standpoint, right?
I don't think that I would ever call get schema async in any of the ways that I consider using get schema to be valuable. The reason this came up is because somebody is using get schema async, get schema at runtime for every connection, and that's not. That's to me, you're already going into a negative case, and that's the only time where I've seen actually doing this async would make any difference. Shai may have other examples, I'm not sure. But I don't think the async overload here is very useful, and I suspect that's why it was never there in the first place. But there are kind of some degenerate uses of get schema table where it could be.
So wait, there's a lot of async things that were not introduced in the first place because they weren't. And that has nothing to do with their usefulness. It's just they
I
were
agree,
overlooked,
that's true too.
like begin
But
transactions.
this
So
case
wait.
isn't very useful.
Now, this case, whether this is a perf, whether it makes sense or not is going to depend on application. And I know of people who use, who do use this for every single thing. And you could say they're doing it wrong, but I mean, the API is there and it's their application. I think, they have a right to do it. And to finish off, I mean, basically the goal here, I think, is for all of the live API surface that's still being maintained and in .NET, we basically don't want people to have to do sync IO. It's that simple. And this thing is kind of trying to close that corner. That's all. Now we can discuss how we're going to introduce it and whether it's going to refer or not. But I mean,
So we're not even implementing this for SQL Server right in .NET 5. So this is.
I have no idea.
Well, we haven't prepared a PR, and as far as I'm aware, we haven't told Microsoft Data, SQL client team that, and there's no indication they're going to do it. So basically, we're putting this in now. We're not actually helping anybody be async at the moment. We're just
But Arthur,
helping
the
lots of
proposal
people
hasn't
be
even gone in yet. So I mean,
What?
I wouldn't propose it to SQL client because this proposal hasn't even been approved at
exactly.
in system data. So
Yeah. So
No providers are going to have this initially.
Oh wait, but hold on. I wouldn't want this to ship with no implementations on it.
Well, that's
Guys,
pretty much the only choice.
one second.
Well, no, it's not the only choice. It's you ship it, you add it at a point in the cycle when you can override it in all of the implementations that we know and care about.
So
Okay. Well,
That's the
I don't
point.
think that work is going to get scheduled anytime soon, so I don't think we should ship this then.
So that's the whole point of having this invoke the sync implementation. It's that it will always work, and providers can implement it at their leisure and when they can. I know I'm definitely going to ship this for NPG SQL. I know the MySQL guy is probably going to do it. SQL client doesn't align with the same release schedule as ADO.NET. As the BCL. I'm not sure why we would kill this just because SQL client might or might not ship this.
What I don't want is for us to add an API that a virtual method that no one overrides. If you're saying that the providers that we do think are important are going to very quickly respond to this by overriding them, then great. And I'd want to quote as much as we can possibly do, validate by at the same time this PR is going in, like putting up the PR that does it in those repos. Obviously it won't work, it won't compile immediately, but like prove it out with implementation.
Then I'm going to propose right now from a manager perspective that we punt this, because that's more work than we were taking on when we brought this proposal. I know Shai won't be happy because he wants to get this in.
How is this
we're bringing more work? Because what Stephen's saying is that we should implement this in Microsoft Data SQLite, and we should talk to the SQL client team. Otherwise, we're putting it in without.
Well, but those are considered external products to .NET. I think I understood Steve's concern. We shouldn't add it at the base layer, but then have other things inside .NET not utilize it.
There's nothing else in .NET that uses this.
If 3 months after, so we ship .NET 5 in whatever the schedule is, and 3 months later, let's say people are picking up .NET 5 after the holidays, and they're starting to use it, and they go and grab the new version of MPG SQL and whatever else. Like at that point, they start using this new API. It should do the right thing.
What is the right thing?
It
behave asynchronously? Because if you mean it should behave asynchronously, then I would guarantee, I put good money on that other than NPG SQL and maybe MySQL, which are not our most common providers, SQL Server and SQLite are most common providers, I will pretty much guarantee that neither of those will do it asynchronous in that time frame. In fact, SQLite can't because it's not asynchronous in the first place.
First and foremost important thing is that it's functionally correct. Someone is able to change their code. They say await foo async instead of foo, and their app continues to work and function, and it has the possibility of actually running asynchronously. The next is
has the possibility. What do you mean by the possibility of running asynchronously? You mean it might?
Yes.
Well, that's going to be the case always, right? If we put this in, there always might be a provider that does it. And
I said that the functional correctness is the first and foremost concern. I had a second thing that I was getting to. The second thing is that there's some additional benefit to doing that code change, right? Just making that code change and having there be no asynchronous implementations from anything they might possibly use is wasted effort on their part. There's no benefit. They would only do it. What?
And we shouldn't do this.
But that's not what I'm hearing from Shai. I'm hearing from Shai that some number of months after.
I absolutely think. I mean, Arthur,
the only one that Shai controls is MPG SQL. So yes, because it's his open source project, he can implement it and ship it, and that's fine. But that's him. That's one person doing both sides of it.
Arthur, if I may get a word in, if this is our bar, then we will never ever introduce anything into ADO.NET ever again in the future, because there will never be a point where we can get something in and guarantee that all of our providers are specifically. So assuming we want to, at any point, introducing anything into ADO.NET, that logic can't work. So
I agree. That's why the logic is completely broken. But if that is the logic, then we shouldn't do this.
Well, I'm not done. All I'm trying to say, it's very simple. So there's a model already about how these things work in ADO.NET. You introduce an async thing, it delegates to this sync thing because obviously not everybody's going to implement it. It's not ideal because it's going to work synchronously but not asynchronously, but everybody can use that API always, and it's always going to work. And as time goes on, Oracle and they're using those APIs, and it is what it is, and they can complain with Oracle or not, and it is what it is. That's not so. With your logic, we should never have introduced async at all in ADO.NET because Oracle is there and it is not doing it.
I'm just saying that if we're not going to make changes to ADO.NET unless there is actual 3 months later providers that implement that, then I agree with you. We should never take any more changes in ADO.NET, which is why that statement I don't think makes any sense.
So
but if that's the statements that's coming from the BCL review people here, then they're basically saying don't change ADO.NET anymore, and that's fine. I'm happy to not change ADO.NET anymore.
My 3 months is me waving hands. It's a saying that at some point in the foreseeable future, there are going to be implementations of this thing. If we can't make that statement, then there is zero benefit to adding the API. If we can say that there will be implementations of this in the foreseeable future, then there is benefit. That's all.
There will be implementations, yes. Not for 90% of our 95% of our customers, but for the people using Postgres, there will be an implementation, and for the few of those that are actually calling this API, there will be benefit. It's extremely minimal, it's extremely small, but that's just the way these kinds of things are.
I think like
I have a quick.
Yeah, just to interject one thing really quick. So like, I take Stephen's point more as there's this point in time argument, right? It shouldn't take 10 years. But then there's also the just practical argument of it's always problematic if you ship an abstraction that you don't implement, because my confidence in us getting the abstractions right is very low because abstractions are usually hard. So like, to me, it's not so much important that by the time we ship everybody has it. It's more that we have done it enough that we validated that our abstractions are correct and that they're actually viable, right? So like, if for example Shai does these methods, implements them in Postgres and says, yep, they work fine and I like the way they work, that to me almost like nails it, right? If we don't convince the SQL guys to override these methods in any given time frame, then that's unfortunate, but I wouldn't hold that necessarily hostage against any given feature, right? Because the very problem that we have at the bottom is that almost all our abstractions are implemented by a gazillion people, and in order for us to make progress, we have to start somewhere, right? And if the somewhere is everywhere, then it's extremely expensive for us to move things forward. That was kind of what .NET Framework used to be, right? So I'm kind of agreeing with Shai, like let's pick some area where we can make progress, and if not everybody comes along for the ride, that's fine. But I also want to make sure that Stephen's point of us not shipping bogus abstractions is also checked off, right? So I'm honestly fine with saying if we get one other provider to do the work before we ship, so we validate the abstractions, that's fine by me. If then nobody overrides the method, that's unfortunate, but I don't think that's a deal breaker necessarily.
Okay, so what you said there is before we ship, right? So you're saying if we have MPG SQL implement this before we ship .NET 5, then it's okay.
Yes, I mean, they don't have to ship it, right? They only have to validate it that it works, right? And that the abstractions that we defined here are viable.
And I think Shai can probably commit to that, right?
I mean, it's an async counterpart to an abstraction that's already there. So I think it's the safest kind of thing we could ever do in terms of introducing an abstraction. And yes, of course, this is going to go in my provider, and I'm hoping it's also going to be in at least 2 others. We do control, so we have very good relations with MySQL. We also control the SQLite one if we care about that.
But
although it doesn't.
SQLite isn't async at all ever.
I know.
So there's zero value in doing anything in SQLite, right?
Okay. And we've also seen that the SQL client team has been quite reactive in doing some things.
Yeah, SQL client might do it, but they're not going to do it in .NET 5 because they have a different ship schedule. And if we put this in .NET 5, they're not going to do it before we ship .NET 5. And again, so that is again why I was saying, if that's what we're saying, we need to push this back to .NET 6 so we can align those things and get it. If we're okay with
what do you think we should do,
a number of providers,
I want to understand what do you think we should do here.
Are you asking me to like step back right to the beginning of why we're even bringing this issue, and that's what we should do?
No,
I
I'm
would
just
say
thinking.
Don't bring this issue. I don't think it's worthwhile. If we are going to do this, then I think we should just put it in there like we always have done and let providers implement it as and when they can, because that's what we've always done with ADO.NET, and it makes sense. I think it's pointless to try and wait for some number of providers to try and implement this. And if it is, we need to coordinate that and make sure we have that. But that's not what we've done before, and it's not what we're planning to do with the batching API even, and that's a much, much bigger abstraction, right?
I mean,
in those cases, we've
I mean, one option you have is like, we don't have to do the work at the exact same time, right? But generally speaking, we need to align multiple horses to, come into the goal at the same time. it might be better to do it early in .NET 6, where you actually have more runway left to talk to the SQL folks,
So-
rather than doing it late in .NET 5, right? But like, I'm personally of the opinion
Yes.
that this feature is small enough and the abstraction is simple enough that just having one person saying, "Yep, I was successful in implementing this," would be fine by me. Like, if there's a more complicated
Yeah, I agree.
API where we say, okay, there's multiple different ways you can implement this, and we want to validate it at least in 2 or 3 providers, then yeah, punting this to .NET 6 and doing it early there probably makes more sense. Does that help you,
I think
Shai?
it's fine. Just
Yeah.
put it in. Yeah, that's not what I was hearing.
Stephen, do you agree with what I said?
What you hear me? Yes, with the caveat that I really don't like the idea of putting it in an API without any semblance of an idea that it's going to be implemented. It sounds like that's not the case here. It sounds like there will be at least one guaranteed implementation within, I don't know, in February or something.
Right.
And fine. But if adding a new async version of a sync API that will never be async doesn't make sense.
I agree with that too.
Right.
All right, so what I'm
So
hearing
from what
is-
you have on screen right now, Emo, I think we do want the cancellation tokens in the simpler overloads. And I threw in chat an example of essentially it's a muxing demuxing if we think it's still valuable to have all 3 virtual. But we could possibly get away here with only virtual. It's just a question of if it's important to maintain the argument null exception on collection name, and I don't have super strong feelings because the feelings I do have are in conflict. One is it should be properly delegating, and the other one is it should be consistent, and I can't have both. So, so if we think it's important, we leave the virtual. If we don't think it's important, we remove the virtual. But yeah, I threw in based on things of it even tries to pay attention to the cancellation token, though I did this from memory, so the words that I used may not be right.
So I think, given the complexity of the existing design, I would probably go with what we currently have on screen because it's the easiest one to do, where you just follow the normal pattern where you override them in pairs, right? You override the sync one and the async one at the same time, and they're basically 1-to-1. And the fact that there's 3 overloads doesn't matter because they're apparently, based on the sync ones, there are 3 independent things you can override. So I would just keep that.
Because, yeah, since this isn't doing deferral, or even if it was doing deferral with passing null for collection name, really it's the simple method can honestly do whatever it wants for any provider. It just has a suggestion, which really means that this is really more of a interface than a base class, but
right.
Sure.
That looks better to me too.
All right, so then let's close this one. Then let's look at maybe at least one other issue so that maybe this is a fast one, I don't know. Like, is there another one that we can do fast? This one seems small enough.
Yeah.
Maybe. I thought that the first one was very small.
Maybe less controversial.
Okay.
Yes, but it was async and virtual and non-deferring, and yeah, it just hit all the buttons of let's drag this out.
Okay, I'll have a go at this then. So, okay, this is 2 issues that belong together. This one is about adding a property, a bool property to DbException. So DbException is supposed to be the base class of all exceptions thrown by database providers. The proposal would add isTransient on it to allow database providers to expose whether they think the exception is transient or not. What that means is whether retrying the operation that triggered this exception be expected to succeed. Now, just to give a bit of background, so databases are, there's networking, there's various kinds of transient exceptions, some networking, some related to the database. There's a whole slew of retrying strategies and various resilience kind of things. If people are familiar maybe with Poly, which is kind of like a resiliency package for .NET. The problem is that right now, when I want to build resilience into my application and I use ADO.NET, it's all on me to know, how my database driver, which kind of error codes it exposes, which error codes are transient and which aren't. And this kind of thing happens again and again and again. So EF Core, if you look, there's some links down here, EF trying strategy inside it, which has a hard-coded list of error codes for SQL client, for SQL Server specifically, which it will retry when it sees those errors. Now, the proposal here would be to move that into the driver, so to make the driver take control of the concept of transientness. And also, as a new error code comes in, so the driver can simply flag it as transient and report that up. So basically new execution strategies using Poly or whatever will now be able to use this piece of information automatically, and even in a database portable way, if that's relevant. So one property, virtual, false by default. That's basically it.
And then, so the idea is that the driver will basically say, like, oh, this is a networking issue that might be something where retry would make sense. And then they would basically have their own logic to say, okay, this error code is one of those, this error code isn't. And they just write themselves a helper method that basically does the switch. And then they would just say,
exactly,
like true false based on that, right?
It's moving the switch inside. That's basically what it is.
That makes sense to me. So the only thing is, like, based on the previous discussion, like, do we think that strategy makes sense, or is there other state that people would have to track, which wouldn't be reasonable for a provider to do?
So I think there definitely is other state, but it's also not necessarily expected that this thing be the only thing that people look at when deciding if they want to retry something. So it's perfectly reasonable. Even today, people can look at the DbException and they can look at other things. This is basically supposed to be expressing that part of it. But if you have anything else that's going to govern that decision, that's fine, and that stays there.
Right. I guess my question is, like, if I'm submitting an insert statement, right, and that failed for whatever reason, right? Basically the question is, what should I do in order to get good behavior out of the system? Like, if if the provider gives me a false return value here where it says true when I really shouldn't have had, would I have accidentally done something bad to my database by having, for example, inserted the same data twice?
You mean if the provider badly implements this?
Yes.
Yes. So, to give some context on this, right now in EF Core, we have, actually in EF6 as well, we have a list of SQL Server error numbers, which we update periodically based on information from the SQL Server team and SQL Azure to say, because they tell us that these are transient errors that you should retry on. Now, if your retrying is not buffering or not doing something correctly, then everything goes to hell, basically. However, what we're proposing here is we remove that behavior. Instead of it basically being EF Core has list of SQL Server error numbers, the SQL client provider would have this list of error numbers, and it would say these are transient for those, and then SQL Server would update the SQL client provider when they change the list of transient error numbers, rather than it being updated in EF Core.
Gotcha.
Right. Now, this could still, even the EF Core thing, the current EF Core stuff and this, or the EF Core based pattern, if you were doing something like calling a stored procedure and it did an insert which succeeded, followed by an insert, and it wasn't using transactions, and it did a second insert which hit a timeout of I couldn't get a lock in time because someone had this table locked, and then it calls a lock a transient error, and you try again, you're going to repeat the insert into the first table, which may now turn into a non-transient error of duplicate data, or it may be redundant data.
You can't do that. If you're using EF correctly, it won't allow you to do that.
Right, but I mean, the notion of once you're doing something like a stored procedure where multiple work could have been done, this would be the only place that I can think of where is transient true, or even looking at the error. The error code would be lead you down a bad path.
That's not true, because, for example, if you're doing a query and you've returned some stuff from it, and then you get a transient error, and then you just restart that query, you're going to get duplicates. You've done something to avoid doing that. So basically, if your retrying is not done correctly, if it's not using transactions correctly, or if you're doing non-idempotent stored procedure mappings, then the last one, that is your right up to you. Everything else, should be handled by the retrying strategy, and that's what EF does. But if you don't do that correctly, then yes, it's very easy to get into bad states by retrying when you shouldn't.
So is it fair to say, like, this is not basically saying safe to retry, right? It's just saying it's a transient error. So if you have everything else done correctly, you should probably retry.
So for example, EF is going to roll back transactions, it's going to dump the stuff that it's buffered and start buffering again, and all those things that it does to allow that retry to happen correctly without issues.
Makes sense.
It's a question of scope, and the second point addresses this exactly. So this doesn't tell you anything beyond that the error itself indicates a condition that is transient.
Right.
What you do with this, what kind of execution, retry or not, that's a completely out of scope thing.
Right. Yeah, I think I buy that. Like that it's kind of like a building block towards it without providing any sort of guarantees, right? And that makes sense to me. So, previous question. So basically, you already said you have a table for SQL Server. So I suppose part of the work would be to work with that team to implement that switch statement on SqlState, right?
Yes.
And we would probably do the same for, I guess, the Postgres one that Shai owns, right?
Yep. And MySQL, I think, is on board to do something similar.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Any other concerns with name or?
That seems reasonable. So I do note, or have observed, that in your notes, you suggest they should err on the side of calling something transient, but you have the default as being false. So I assume that just means in docs you're going to have it as a suggested implementation is to err on the side of transients.
Yes. It's guidance only, because most errors in the world are definitely not. I wouldn't think they are transient. So it's not a good default to say always retry. However, it's just when a writer is kind of not sure. This sometimes could be transient, sometimes it might not. Then in those kinds of situations, it's better to err on the side of saying yes.
Right. But so that instead of saying they should do a switch and look for lock contention or other sort of transient things and return true, they should look for syntax error and other sorts of things that are permanent errors and return false.
I don't know if I'd go that far. I mean, so the specific behavior inside is going to be provider dependent. I still kind of, the way I've seen this implemented and the way it's implemented in my driver is still in like a list of things which are considered transient. So you don't, I still didn't implement it the other way, but it's a good question. It is a question.
I think that what this note is actually trying to assert is that, for example, you could fail to connect because that's a persistent failure, like somebody's actually cut the optical cable, right? And so in that case, it wouldn't be a transient error. But you should err on the side of saying that if you fail to connect, that is a transient error, and we should retry a few times in case even though it might be permanent. I think that's what you were trying to say, right, Shai?
Pretty much.
Okay, so that the nature, so report true whenever the nature of the error is transient, even if you could prove, like, I know this is never going to work because I own this DNS name and I refuse to renew it. So.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So then.
Yeah.
Okay. So then let's take this one as is, and I guess this is the other one that comes with that, right?
If you want a small one and the one that comes with it, no, the other one, not this one.
Okay. So then that sounds good.
So this one is quite connected. So we talked about transients on exceptions. This is another thing that we could, that I'm proposing we introduce on the same DbException. So there's a standard for SqlState, which is in the SQL standard 5-character code with a standardized meaning. So this 5-letter code means unique constraint violation. That 5-letter code means something else. This is actually standardized. Unfortunately, it's not completely followed, so it's not followed by all databases. SQL Server doesn't follow this, but the ODBC and JDBC layers have a shim, which translate the SQL Server errors into this thing. And there's interest in by China from the SQL client team to do some kind of translation also. In Postgres, this is native. In MySQL, this is native as well. So it's not a 100% kind of mechanism, but it's still something that would allow exposing an exception code, which is completely database portable. And so to detect in a database portable way, at least for most databases, for example, a unique constraint. You can read more about it, obviously, on the issue.
So that would
out of curiosity, if the two things go in together, would you try implementing transients in terms of SqlState, or is that too complicated?
So I mean, it's a good question. So some database providers, SQLite doesn't have SqlState at the moment. So unless it starts translating it internally, then it could still implement is transient without even, looking.
Right, I'm saying the other one you said is transient virtual default false. I'm just curious if you would do is transient virtual. Here are a bunch of SqlState codes that are transient as the default implementation.
So in Postgres, that's the only error code you have is SqlState. So effectively, is transient is already currently implemented on top of SqlState for Postgres. But that's a Postgres thing because that's already there. I don't have anything else to implement is transient over, if you will.
No, I mean, I guess the question is, like, if we assume a world where we have both SqlState and is transient, right, on DbException. One thing we could be doing in the default implementation, as opposed to returning false, you would say if SqlState is not null, do the translation, and then we have a better default, right, for providers that basically only provided SqlState.
It's an interesting idea. I didn't think about this. I'm a bit too suspicious of database portability to go with something like this. But maybe if I look into some research for the default implementation, that could actually make sense.
And there are things like lock contention is what happened here. Then that could be an easy default for. We have some cases here that return true, so theoretically you can get away with only defining SqlState.
That's a nice idea.
And then you just don't have to. It wouldn't be that everybody has the exact same switch statement for is transient of exactly falling back to their SqlState map. So
we should probably be do the research onto what the different providers do, but we can be somewhat conservative in the default implementation too. And then things like Oracle will get some value from this even if they don't update, and things like Postgres and SQL Server and MySQL can always do a more accurate translation if necessary on those providers, right?
Wow.
And or open PRs to improve the base map. So
agreed, yeah. But there may be cases where SQL Server says this kind of SQL error, we do consider it transient, and Postgres says it's not transient. So I don't know if we'll have to do that research. It might not be that the base map may need to be by design different from some of the specific ones.
Right.
Unfortunately, Oracle wouldn't benefit from this because it would have to actually implement SqlState.
Oh yeah. No, okay. Well, I tried.
Yeah. This is just a question of if it's easily, because they feel related, and so this is if we can provide a good default for the Boolean one in terms of the complicated one, then I think that we should attempt to do so.
Yeah. It's a nice idea. Yeah.
All right, then let me just improve this one here.
All right, and I have to drop, otherwise I don't get to eat lunch today.
Yeah, I think we're now 15 minutes over. I don't know, is this one something we can do in 5 minutes, or should we book another time slot for that?
I don't know. I can try. I don't know. Whatever you guys think.
Then let's just
probably another one.
Sorry, what?
I would guess that this is going to require some discussion on what it actually does, and
okay, then
that would be my guess.
Then let me just book another slot for that. Is this super urgent, or is this something that we can do later?
No, as long as I'd like to get this for .NET 5. Nothing beyond this.
Okay, then let me just try to find another slot where this would make sense. Should there be anybody else here, or just you and Arthur again?
I think the same.
Okay, cool. Then I will do that, and then I don't know when the next slot is because they're all booked now, but we'll find something.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, and then enjoy the rest of the day.
So